And for today's session, we'll focus on reporting obligations and transparency in the DSA. My name is Alexandra Lafitz. I am the president of EURISPA, the European Association of Internet Service Providers, and we represent over 2,000 ISPs across Europe, all along the internet value chain. So basically, that means access providers, internet exchanges, telecoms, dominant registries, illegal content hotlines, hosting providers, etc. And this morning's session is the third one of our 2021 series called DSA in Focused. And we kicked things off in April with a session on notice and action procedures. And it was followed by a second session on measures going beyond content removal in May. And so throughout the year, we will host another 3 events, each one focusing on a specific aspect of the DSA. So for instance, the next one is going to be on the liability of intermediaries. And we're also going to have another one on complaints and dispute handling and redress in the DSA. And the idea, the rationale of this whole series of events is to give you, an expert look into the key points of this text and to, try in the end to see how this text works and how we could make it better and work well for all the stakeholders involved. I really want to also take a moment to renew my gratitude to the London Internet Exchange for sponsoring this series of events. And before I introduce our distinguished panelists, I have to go through the tedious part of housekeeping rules. So first of all, and I'm very sorry you have muted everyone, to avoid any background noise to which we've gotten very used this past year. And also we'd like to make this event as interactive as possible. And so after the panel, we will invite your comments and questions. So if you have any question, comment, etc., you can drop them in the chat. Also, ideally specifying to whom this question is directed, and I'll submit them to the panelists after the panel segment. And last but not least, this event is recorded. It will be shortly available on the EURISPA website. So, to kick things off, I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists. So first of all is Ms. Irene Laguna, the Deputy Head of Unit for E-commerce and Platforms at the DG Connect, so the European Commission. On second, we have Michal Fikes, Senior Public Affairs Advisor to CESNA, which is also a former member of EURISPA. And last but not least, we have Jigar Naranjo, Head of Policy for EDRI. Unfortunately, we're supposed to have an opening segment by our very own Malcolm Hattie, who is chair of EURISPA's Intermediary Liability Committee and head of Public Affairs for Links. But due to network issues, I will cover the introductory segment of the discussion. So, as EURISPA, we've always tried to find the right balance between competing interests due to our very wide membership and also to the fact that our organization has been going on for 20 years. And so we have this very specific philosophy on how the internet should work, being allowing companies to thrive while also being directed towards the users and towards fundamental rights. And so in this text, we've noted 4 elements which we found particularly interesting. So the idea of statements of reasons, the concept of algorithmic transparency, the transparency of content moderation through opt-in or opt-out from the ranking systems, and also the vetted researchers and their access to data. And in our view, meaningful transparency needs to strike a balance between many interests. You have governments who need to gather information on the activities of intermediaries to orient their policy choices and also to ensure the trust of citizens. The citizens, they need transparency to understand their rights and if they are being respected, and also to understand what is going on while they're using a service. And companies on their end, they need to operate in an environment of trust, preserving the cybersecurity and also the confidentiality of their trade secrets. So I hope that during this event, we'll be able to cover all these issues. We have very interesting and diverse perspectives in this panel, so I hope that we can use them to feed into the overall debate on the DSA. So without further ado, let's start the whole panel discussion. And to give you an idea, we've prepared a few different questions that will allow us to tackle this issue through different angles, and so the panelists will be able to give us their perspective. The first question is a very broad one. The idea is, what is, in your ideal world, the best transparency framework that we could achieve within the DSA? So to start, I would like to give the floor to Irene so that you can explain to us the rationale behind the text, and then we'll open the floor to Diego and Michal for what their suggested changes could be.
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. And in these early morning hours, indeed, the question is a very valid one. What is in the ideal world the best transparency framework? And what can I say? I think the Commission proposal is the best transparency framework that we could come with. And also, I am really grateful for the invitation for this particular event. I see that, as you have said, you have talked already about notice and action procedures and removal obligations. But if I have to choose one word that defines the DSA, the Digital Services Act, is about transparency. If you look for the word transparency or transparent, it appears, I think, 39 times across the whole DSA proposal, and remove only 30 times. So even if the attention always goes to liability and removal of content, the truth is that transparency and the need for a transparent and safe environment and accountability that comes through transparency is the spirit of the DSA. So for years, as you know very well, we have been discussing, policymakers and stakeholders have been discussing whether platforms have to act against illegal content or not, and why not. And in the meantime, we have seen that during the years, all these decisions have been taken on the basis of the terms and conditions, unilaterally, not always transparently. And at the end of the day, what we need is not only a framework that establishes rules on the removal of illegal content. In the DSA, we have removal on the basis of an order or on the basis of a notice, but we need to know why and these decisions are taken and what to do in that case. So, and let's not forget again that it's not only about platforms. We always have platforms in mind when we talk about these issues, but it's about all intermediaries in the online space. Internet service providers also have content moderation rules. They also have conducted voluntary opt-out, opt-in mechanisms, parental controls, etc. So all this information is relevant. But not all information is equally relevant to everyone, and not information is relevant for all types of intermediaries. So the DSA, in my view, has built a complete and sometimes complicated um, layers that are put together of transparency that apply cumulatively and also with different addresses. The user needs information about the terms and conditions when they enter into a service as regards in particular content moderation, and that applies to all types of intermediaries. But the user also needs to be informed about the reasons for removal or not, and in the case of hosting service providers. Also, the notice provider needs to know what happened with the notice. There is a need for information before your account is suspended or terminated. And I think that's a very, very important tool. And also, if your content was subject of a removal order, this is an important information for the user. But also the general public needs to have the general information through transparency reports on how the different intermediaries in the internet stack, from the more technical intermediaries to the biggest platforms, they need to know what they do in a comparable and also aggregatable manner. The statement of reasons that you mentioned that the user will receive when content has been removed, this will be compiled in a database that is a sort of what we have today in the Lumen database in the United States. This is information of general interest, but not for everyone. My mother-in-law won't go and read the transparency reports, as interesting as they are, but it's in particular interesting for researchers, for collective redress organizations, for civil rights organizations, to help identify whether decisions are taken on a consistent and objective manner. And this transparency reporting obligation is proportionate, in my view, and tailored to the different type of service. So we have different layers of granularity of the information. But not only the service providers need to be transparent, also the regulators, the digital services coordinators need to issue also an annual report on what they do on the regulation of online intermediaries, but also on regulation of the content, on how many notices, how many orders their authorities send. All this transparency reporting will bring an added value and accountability. But then there is another layer of information, which is not general information for the general user, but it's for the regulators to identify possible lack of compliance with the DSA, but also for vetted researchers that will have the possibility, but also the knowledge and understanding to find out the risks that can emerge from very large online platforms. Because if we are shedding light into how platforms in particular and the very large platforms define the online space and have an impact on the content, we need to know what to do with the information that we get. It's like opening up the door to a library, and then it happens that the library contains books in languages that we don't understand. So we need to have an important added value from researchers and from auditors in order to identify the problems that might emerge from the automated decision making, for instance. So these different layers make sense in my view, because too much information equals no information. So the user needs meaningful information, but the regulator and the researchers will need extensive information. So I will stop here. I think we have managed to get the balance right in terms of how much information and what is the level of access to that information that we need to have a transparent and safe online environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irene. Maybe a second, I'd like to give the floor to Sumihao, whose company is going to be subjected to these new obligations. And so I'd like to see what your take on that is.
Thank you. Very good morning to everybody. I have to admit I don't have any wild dreams on transparency and ideal world of transparency obligations. So let me just probably state few base stones that I feel the most important when setting up any new framework in this area. First of all, I think it's super important to build on things that are already working and have been well tested in the past, which is the reason why I think it's very great to see that the Digital Services Act is in fact building on the cornerstones of the e-commerce directive and taking the best things out of it. This is something that I feel very well thought. Secondly, I think it's super important to respect the differences between different online platforms, hosting services, and to carve those liabilities and transparency obligations respectfully with the services that we're looking at. Also, something that I see as part of the DSA, which clearly attempts to differentiate between liabilities of service providers, online platforms, and differentiating between obligations of very large online platforms as well, which is, from my view, a very logical step. I think more needs to be done to also correctly cover search engines as a caching type of service, and also tweak here and there certain liabilities and reporting obligations, which I'm afraid might serve only as a source of bureaucracy in especially smaller companies all around Europe, which would probably produce tons of new reports that no one will read. And I think this is something that we should also foresee while trying to address this in as part of DSA. And probably the last thing, I think the cornerstone of transparency is the terms and conditions of the companies that are offering their services. So in my view, this is where the transparency should start. I think it's not about reports. It's not about tons of informations that will be published in different systems on the decisions that the companies will take based, for example, on removing the illegal content from their services. It's mainly about terms and conditions. This is where the transparency should start. This is where it should be super transparent to users, how the company is actually working with the content and working with users. And it's also in line with one of the fundamental freedoms that we have in Europe, which is the freedom to do business in a way that the businesses believe it's most appropriate to serve the service to their users. So this is probably my starting point. These three areas I consider the most important when carving out any liabilities or any transparency obligations in any new framework like the DSA.
Thank you, Diego. I guess that you want to answer to that.
Well, I think it looks like we have coordinated between the speakers to touch on different subjects. We didn't, but somehow it worked magically. Because for me, I think Irene great oversight of what the reason behind the DSA are, and Michal brought the perspective of a great actor such as Cessna. And then I wanted to focus on only two issues that were barely mentioned, which are transparency for decision making, so notice and action, and the second one on transparency of algorithms. So for the first one, it's a core issue, of course, of digital rights organizations such as EDRI. We have said from the beginning that any notice and action mechanism must follow transparent rules. They need to recognize the rights of all parties involved. And the ESA includes, in fact, brings a lot of good transparency requirements for intermediaries and that remove content that is illegal or in breach of the intermediaries' terms of service. So I think there's a lot of good work there. We see we can fine tune it, and there are some a proposal from Charles de Mos's report that go backwards and that go further. So I think we need to find in the compromise amendments where we find the right wording, but I think it goes in the right direction. And generally, again, we don't praise the Commission very often, but I think generally, in this case, the proposal is already a very good start, and so we need to just improve it. And one thing that we are concerned is that when a notification may trigger liability directly. I think we understand the reasons that some, because of hate speech issues or any other great societal aspect that are very damaging for actual people. We want the company sometimes to do more faster. And we believe that's a risk. We have been working very actively on similar issues from the copyright directive to other similar content moderation legislation, and we believe that this is a big risk. We give the right to anyone, even rights holders or any other actor out there to trigger liability directly. What we're going to see is the platforms getting more and more power instead of less and less power. That's what we would expect from the DSA. So we believe that's a big risk that we need to be tackling now in the text. Then as soon as the intermediary takes action, we always wanted for the intermediary to inform the uploader or the account holder about the reason and the law and the terms of service that they violated. I agree with Michal how bringing more transparency to terms of service is crucial, and it should be part of it. The intermediary also should explain to the uploader and also when known, the notifier how to object to the action taken by the intermediary. So it could be using a valid counter notice, access to further remedies, or the dispute settlement bodies, or the DSCs in this case as well. And there are exceptions, of course. I mean, some of the obligation might be impeding some criminal investigation, so there might be exceptions where this might be delayed, might be even not done at all. probably, but the general rule should be that you should know why your content is taken down and for what reason you should be able to give a counter notice. I think that the Commission proposal goes in the right direction. Secondly, on algorithms, we have been saying, and probably from our members, Panopticon has been the one, our Polish member has been the one bringing a lot of research about how algorithms should be available for auditing and testing. And because we believe that users should know how they work, how content is offered to them, and how they can be in charge of it instead of the company being in charge of them. And so that's the basic lines for algorithm transparency in 2 sentences. I know it's way more complicated in practice, and I wouldn't like to be on the side of companies doing it. But that's our baseline for to start the conversation. And then finally, just very quickly on NATEC, it's no surprise to anyone here that we want to go beyond transparency. Ad transparency is fine. We want these ad archives to be available so people can research and how they work and so on, but we want to go a step further. We work on the e-privacy regulation. We want online tracking to be stopping all of these practices, which, as the EDPS said, it will probably go towards some sort of elimination of the ad tech advertising, or a profound revolution on how it works, because the current system is not it's probably not legal, or it should not be legal. So I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you. I'd like to jump back on something that you mentioned on algorithmic transparency, because so we've seen several ideas going from mere, description in the TNCs on how this could happen, or a very detailed transparency obligation on sharing how the algorithm works and how it's designed and like the whole functioning. And coming from a company perspective, of course, we always worry of our trade secrets and also cybersecurity. I mean, the more option you give out, the more risks you have. And so I was wondering, Michal, maybe if you have a view on this, and also if you also have a view on how we could make sure that we ensure the transparency the users need, no question about that, but also how we can impeach, nefarious actors from gaining really precious information with, your algorithm.
This is actually a great question, because going back to what I started with, was mentioning, let's build on something that is already existing, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. And if we look just 2 years ago, we can dig out a regulation on promoting fairness and transparency for business users of online intermediation services, previously called the P2B regulation, which already sets up many obligations for intermediaries, search engines, and other companies in terms of transparency with algorithms when it comes to this issue. And what I'm missing is actually any kind of assessment of what this has brought already before igniting a debate on let's invent something even wider and even more aggressive against companies to uncover their algorithms or anything even more than it has been approved as part of this regulation. Every legislation, including this P2B regulation, had a great and large assessment of consequences if you do it one way or the other. And, not doing this, skipping this whole sequence and just, adding few amendments into the DSA in this part of legislation process and including any strong obligations on companies, I think would be very risky. So in my view, I think we should build on something that has been already well thought as part of the P2B regulation, which I think plays well balanced between what the companies can show off through the terms and conditions, explaining how their service is in general working, and at the same time trying to address those evil players that are constantly trying to play out companies with their algorithms. Typically, Seznam is one of those rare providers of its own search engine in Europe, which is a typical gameplay, I would say, where everybody's trying to be on the first page of results, which obviously has a limited amount of space where you can place the results. So not everybody can be on the first page, and you have to somehow, through the algorithms that you use, separate those that are first and those that are second. And if you're too transparent by showing those algorithms, too detailed, then obviously everybody, even those who should not be on the first place because their content is not that relevant and should not be on the first place on some query type by user, these players will be able to use this information for their own purpose and lowering the quality of the service to the consumer. So definitely the balance needs to be there, and I think we should already take the experience that we have from the P2B regulation rather than trying to invent something new just 1 year after this regulation is enforced.
Thank you. Irene, maybe from a Commission's perspective, you'd like to get more into this rationale, explaining us this rationale.
Sure. Just to make clear that from the Commission perspective, when drafting the proposal, it was absolutely clear that we do not want to break trade secrets or to open up access to confidential information. So on this, we already have years and years of practice, for instance, on competition enforcement, where we need confidential information from companies, and we get it, and we treat it confidentially. And this is not different here. And actually, if you check the articles regarding enforcement of the DSA, it very much mirrors the enforcement of competition policy. But this is precisely also the reason why we have worked on different layers of transparency. So I fully agree with Michael that users, normal users or notice providers or content providers, they do not need to have access to this information. And it can also be counterproductive to allow rogue actors to game the systems and the content moderation practices and policies. So we think that there is a need to level the access of information from the full transparency and full access to the more restricted access. And at the end of the day, the regulator that needs to check compliance needs to have full access. But obviously, always in full respect of trade secrets and confidential information. We already have the GDPR there for personal data, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And also in the DSA, I think in particular Article 31, when it regulates access to data for very large online platforms, there we make clear that platforms, those very large online platforms, can still retain those confidential information for a more restricted access. And this is fundamental. I don't think anybody disagrees with that.
Diego, I see.
Shall I go ahead? Yeah.
Do you want to say anything to that?
Actually, yes. Well, just very quickly, I think Irene and Michal both pointed out the right points. I wanted to just make an analogy with the COVID-19 vaccines in the same way that, I don't need to see how the vaccines are made. I will not learn anything from it, and I will not solve anything. I think someone, in this case, the European drug agency, I forgot the name right now, and they should be the ones who have access, or doctors, or some sort of trusted auditors, while trade checkers are protected. I think that one thing doesn't contradict the other, and we have there are huge societal implications for recommending systems, for search engines, how they work, and how they shape how people see the world, how they interact with it. And I think that to some extent the public interest probably overrides private interest in this matter. And if some believe it doesn't override, at least we probably all agree that there needs to be we need to find a way where people can have sufficient information and also trust part of the auditors, while at the same time companies do not need to give away all the secrets so people can cheat the search engines such as Sesam and so on. So I think there's some way, and as Irene put it rightly, and there's some good access obligations and quite well defined DSA, and we have the GDPR otherwise.
Thanks, Diego. Don't unmute yourself because I was actually planning on asking you the next question.
Okay.
Irene mentioned the word GDPR, which rang a few bells in my mind. I think we're like nobody's really recovered from this trauma. In the text, there is this discussion on there is this discussion ongoing on the opt-out from content moderation. And as companies, we've been struggling with a very well-known GDPR panels. Do you agree? Do you not agree? And all the different options. And we've identified something that is called consent fatigue from the user. And in this opt-out scenario, do you have a view from a user perspective on how we can make it better? How can we give informed information to the user about their privacy, their content, etc., without overburning them, and so that they, in the end, just click accept all and then face the consequences of accepting everything on a website?
Well, I think that the problem is not on GDPR similar legislation. The problem is on how companies deal with them. So the consent fatigue happens in the way that it is currently designed or implemented by company, perhaps not enforced by the regulators. And because with all of these requests to accept cookies, or perhaps if it's badly implemented in some company, some social media platforms, asking them all the time. So I think that we need to change the way the platforms and all these services work. And one way would be, for example, for let's say some companies that use content moderation, content recommending systems, would be to when they join or when the first time this system changes, they should be forced, they should be stirred into being able to select categories, interests, and to some extent they could be also be offered to say, okay, do you want the algorithm to learn from your selections, or do you not want to do that? But generally, the default should be that the user is in charge of what they want to see, what they want, how they want to interact with the platform, how they receive news, how they share news as well. In a way, it's probably not the most thorough example, but I think the way Netflix operates, for example, is one of these ways. It doesn't, to my knowledge, it doesn't really profile you from the way you interact with other websites or the services or the apps. It doesn't inspire you. Or it only inspires in the way that you select films or TV shows, and building on that, they might recommend you things to keep you watching more content. So to some extent, it's one of the less invasive, one of the probably most privacy-friendly ways that I can imagine in practice. So again, I think there are many ways. We just need to find a way to do it totally different on how it works now, and we'll probably do it better than right now.
Thanks. Maybe Irene, if you want to give us the Commission's perspective on these propositions.
Sure, and this is a very important part of the DSA, even if it, in terms of provisions, is not that relevant. It will have a lot of get a lot of attention in the next steps in the legislative process, and we are well aware of the problems. I mean, personally, I got or I was displayed an ad very recently on some psychological help for middle-aged women, and I got really angry, right? Because this is but this is just an example, and everybody has these examples. There is an important policymaker in the Commission who got an advertisement for funerary services, so it's even worse. But the point is, we do not want, as I said before, we do not want to reinvent the wheel. We have the GDPR. It needs to bring results. Then the question is, what can we do on top of that legislation? We do not need to start again saying, well, you don't have to be profiled, etc. But we see that there is a gap between the right of the user and the possibility for the user to exercise that right, because the information is not meaningful, it's not easily accessible, it's not available there where it should be. It's very well hidden somewhere in the terms and conditions or in the settings of a given service provider. So there are two different parts where this is important. One is on advertising, so that the user knows whether it has been profiled, or he or she has been profiled, and the advertising has been shown for X or Y set reasons, and on recommender mechanisms. And there, our option has been to give the possibility for the user to opt out and have an alternative solution that is not based on profiling. But we did not want to go beyond that, because we do not want to reinvent the GDPR. But we are very well aware that in particular in the parliament, there are strong voices asking for more, and this is something that will have to be discussed.
Thank you, Michal. Do you know how CESNAM feels about this and what your plans could be?
Oh, well, I know, and I tell you, let me probably first underline what Irene just said, because this is super important to underline. It's really important to distinguish the advertising side of the issue and recommender side of the issue. While they might seem very similar, it's two different scenarios that I also would like to address right now, because I think it's important to really look at them one by one. When you look on the recommender systems, there is one good reason why these systems exist. It's not because we in companies don't have anything better to do, and that's why we've invented recommender system. The reason why we have them is because the amount of content is so huge, and it's getting bigger and bigger every single second, that we need to find some ways how to sort that huge amount of content to something that is relevant to user, that is user able to read over or consume, if I might say so. So this is the main reason why we have recommender systems. And if we would not have these possibilities, like those recommender systems, the services would probably be useless, because there will be so large amount of unrelevant content that users would simply feel like the service is not working. And this is logically something we're trying to avoid. In my view, I don't feel like users are actually complaining about recommender systems very much. I think it's really a minority of users that simply have some objections against recommender systems. Majority of users, in our experience, are actually waving for the recommender systems, because if they are done right, they really feel like they are actually offering them a better service and better experience. So at the same time, I already mentioned it in my opening speech, we also have services like the search engines. And if we all throw them in one basket, then I have no idea how to approach the question of creating a news feed in terms of search results page, which would also be part of the DSA, if we not decide that search engines are a caching type of service rather than a hosting or a typically online platform. So there are many issues where you will hit the wall if you start thinking about the recommender systems as something that can be easily opt out, because it's simply just a simple decision of the user. It's not really that simple. When you look on the advertising systems, this is where I understand it's more political topic than anything else. It's a plain politics in my view. We can surely go back 10 years and ban the context or ban the behavioral advertising altogether and get back to something that many of us even don't remember anymore, which was the contextual advertising, where the ads were actually based only on the content that has been shown on the web page, rather than about how the user behaved while browsing the web. And surely this will probably lower the incomes of those online companies from the advertising, which will probably lead to a point that these companies will have to start getting this money from somewhere else. And obviously it will probably be the users and consumers, which logically means that many of the services that consumers are used to consume for free today will be simply behind the paywall, which will be the only logical solution for online platforms to go through. At the same time, the big question is how the countries outside of the EU would react on something like that. if the whole world would still use the behavioral advertising and only European Union would ban this kind of advertising and will switch back to contextual advertising, how this will imbalance the level playing field between European companies and those that are operating outside of the EU in terms of the effectivity and ability to raise income from the advertising, when these outside non-EU companies will still be allowed to profile users and be in this way more effective in view from the advertising perspective. So clearly we need to look on those two issues separately. I think advertising is a political issue, very touchy topic. The recommender system is in fact something that is practically almost impossible to ban, especially on services like the search engines, where simply there is no thing like opting out from having algorithmically organized search results. There is no other way than having the search result being algorithmically organized. There is no other way how to do it. You simply have to boil down those billions of pages that are being sorted out into something meaningful, and there is no way how to do it without using algorithms. So opting out, how would that work? I have no idea.
Thank you. Irene, you'll have to leave us in around 15 minutes, if I remember correctly. So I'd like to get back to something you mentioned actually in your introductory statement, which was the vetted researchers and access to data. So to sum it up, DSCs will be able to grant vetted researchers and access to the data of very large online platforms for the purpose of conducting research on the identification and understanding systemic risks. And we've seen several amendments, both in the Parliament and Council, who'd like to extend this to further groups from the civil society, for instance. And we see a potential risk that some actors who will be granted access will have their own interest, agendas, ideological drivers, being financed by foreign actors, etc. And so, in your view, how can we ensure that this success, which again is very important, is not abused by those who are interested in it?
Indeed, that's one topic that it's being discussed right now in the council and also in the parliament. And I think there is a legitimate tension between an expectation to have access and to be able to understand the system, and the need to ensure that the access is given to the right people and not to give unnecessary or dangerous access to information that could be used, as I said before, to game the system. So this is why I still think that the Commission proposal is the right balance, because it opens up the access to researchers as a way of getting also assistance from third parties to the regulators and to the Commission itself when we need to enforce the rules and to identify compliance. We need to have experts that understand what we are seeing, right? This is what I mentioned before with this simple comparison to the library. We think that researchers are an important access point to understand the problems and to identify emerging risks, for instance. So in our proposal, we ask those researchers to comply with certain criteria, certain conditions. So not anyone, I just enroll in a PhD program, I am a researcher, I need to have access. It has to comply with certain conditions, with the necessary experience, with commercial independence, that they don't have hidden or not so hidden commercial interests in getting access to that information, and a purpose limitation. That's key. I mean, the access to information is not just for the sake of writing the next PhD, is to identify risks and to assist in the compliance to the rules of the DSA. So it needs to have a purpose. Whether this can be opened to civil rights associations, I don't have a clear view on that, and this will be discussed over the legislative process, I think the access could be open to the extent that it is well accompanied with all the necessary safeguards. I think we all in the room agree that civil rights associations might also have a legitimate interest in ensuring that the DSA is respected and we comply with, or the very large online platforms comply with the risk assessments and risk mitigation measures. But it's if we open up the hand, then the question is where to stop. Then we will have international organizations also wanting to have access granted, private organizations, sometimes researchers also have a public-private nature, and we need to go deeper into the details of those of the access. And also in our proposal, we give us the possibility via delegated acts to write down more clearly these conditions.
Thank you. Michal, should the principle be agreed on, in your view, how could we ensure, the balance?
Just a disclaimer, Seznam is not most likely be viewed as a very large online platform in the context of DSA. So this is a fight of someone else rather than of Seznam, but or at least for some time from now on. But still, my take on this is that clearly some access to information for research purposes is definitely necessary. I think Irene mentioned it at the very beginning that even the Commission from time to time, as part of their competition works, needs to have an access to different sets of data to be able to evaluate how the market is working and how things are going. The question is whether these obligations or these rights should not be granted to the Commission itself, where the researchers on behalf of the Commission should be allowed to access such data with some deeper and more tightened scrutiny on which data are being accessed and how they will actually be used throughout the research. We've been touching upon the issue of the trade secrets, and my feeling is that whenever you allow a researcher to go and dig into the data of some companies, you're definitely very near to something that can be considered a trade secret. So in my view, I would be very careful about who should be let in. I would definitely not extend the amount of what is already set up in the DSA. And I would probably even question whether the national digital coordinators are the right body for allowing researchers to get in to the very large online platforms data, if it's not the Commission or some other body which would be more suitable to make these important decisions. But as I say, this is the fight of someone else.
We wish you all the best on your way to become.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Diego, so you represent an organization who might be interested
Yes.
in gaining access, or whose partners organization might be interested. So
yeah, I think the EDRI Brussels office would like to already, even in law, to opt out for this. We do have enough work already, so we don't want to do that. But as you said, it is true that many of our members would be happy to give this access, so they can perhaps do some data protection complaints, they can investigate, and they can launch complaints before the DSCs against Facebook or YouTube or any of these big actors. I can imagine that happening by some of our members, such as NOIB or Panopticon and Privacy International and so on. But then I agree with what Irene and Michal said. I think we have Article 31. We can also think about non-disclosure agreements. We need a clear process to select auditors. And on top of that, DSCs can do the oversight. So I agree. I mean, when Irene was mentioning the issue of the PhD students, might be because she also received lots of requests from students every week to interviews or surveys and so on. And we also do that. So I feel the pain. And so, yeah, I agree that not everyone should have access to all the data all the time. I think that's ridiculous. And I think no one is asking for that. And only those who have a vested interest, and they go through a process, the oversight of DSCs. And I think that's a relatively easy way to one of the easy aspects of the DSA, I think. I hope it's not too controversial.
Thank you. I would, speaking of database, have a very last question on the statements of reasons. Still going on with my obsession at the moment of making it information useful for everyone, and this time also respecting the individual's privacy. Irene, before you leave us, maybe you want to say a few words on your rationale, and then we'll continue the discussion.
Sure. The rationale behind getting a statement of reasons is that this is the very least any user would have to get when some decision is taken by a third party, in this case, an intermediary on your content, right? Even if it's applying a contract that you have signed, you are allowed to use my services for this or for this content. You need to understand why this party considers that you have breached those terms and conditions. But also, and even more, when someone decides that your content is illegal, because this entails liability for you as content provider. We always talk about liability of intermediaries, but we forget that the first person who is liable for something which is illegal is the perpetrator, right? The one who is posting something. So I think it's an elemental point of information for due redress to know if you are being accused of something and on which purposes. So I think this is a key element of any notice and action procedure. In the Digital Services Act, we keep notice and action limited to what is illegal. We do not want to build by law a process to help private actors to implement their contracts. We think that this is beyond the objective of the law, but the statement of reasons is extended also to decisions based on that contract, on the terms and conditions, because it helps. It's a right for the user. Then, and I think everybody agrees with that. You need to have access to that information. There are some concerns from the perspective of enforcement authorities saying you should not inform the perpetrator if you are going to take action. But this is not the role of the intermediary, in my view. I think in the DSA, we have tried to keep very clearly separated what is the public enforcement and what is the private enforcement. But then there is a different layer of information, which is putting all these statements of reasons together, obviously in a pseudonymized or anonymized manner without the personal data, in order to understand also whether the decisions are taken in an objective manner, in a consistent manner, a non-discriminatory manner. We have seen over the years that the most interesting studies on the well-functioning of notice and action procedures have come from access to the Lumen database, which is led by a university in the United States. And we think that this kind of compilation is very useful to understand the process and to see how it works and how it is used or misused by the relevant participants. So that's the idea behind.
Thank you very much. Mira, I see you nodding quite extensively. So do you want to tell us from a company's perspective, how do you plan on working on the statements of reasons to guarantee that balance?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, first of all, I think this is definitely a costly thing for companies to oblige to. I mean, in our national association body, where we did some research on how this will probably be quantified, we've found out that there is expected 10 times increase in costs on the side of platforms in the scale of Czech Republic. If companies would be forced to generate all these new amounts of decisions and publish them, and also anonymize, which I think is something very important, because it's not just going to be published. You will have to walk through every single decision and make sure that it is well anonymized before it's being uploaded to any registry where these decisions will be sought. And at the same time, there will be hundreds, thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of decisions that will be all the same. In fact, they will duplicate each other because it will be still the same breaches that you will address in your decisions on the side of companies. Still, in many cases, it takes just few seconds for user to breach the terms and conditions, and it will take tens of minutes, probably hours, for lawyers to prepare the right decision, which needs to be, fulfilling all those obligations that the DSA, as part of the Article 15, will put upon on every single decision on content removal that will need to be prepared. And I think this is very unfair for companies that will fight these rogue users that will simply try to do something which is against the terms and condition or upload the illegal content, and then employ many rounds of hours of people on the side of hosting platforms, which will simply have to cope with that as part of the removal process. So I consider this unfair. I think there should be some relief on the side of platforms in these situations. Maybe even the publishing of the decisions into a public register is something where I would see a relief well done to the companies, because at least the anonymization procedure that will have to be walked through with every single decision would be very significant on the side of platforms, and that would be very appreciated.
Thank you, Miha. Diego, you've unmuted yourself, you know the drill.
Yes, from our side, we see how companies such as YouTube and so on, they scan for content, they block content very quickly. So I can imagine they have the expertise and staff to, in addition to doing that, explain why they did it. I think that with strong powers comes big responsibility, right? And I think this is one of the situations. And regarding the treatment, data protection, and privacy, it reminds me of some of the debates that I hear often from international forums such as ICANN, where they keep asking, how do we do this data protection thing? I mean, since 1995, we have data protection legislation in the EU. They keep asking, they don't know how to do it with the list of registrars and so on. So I think the answer is again the same. Since 1995, you know how to do it, and since the GDPR, you know how to do it. So follow that. We created a legislation. There's case law. There's a lot of decisions from data protection authorities on how to implement it. If you don't know, you ask your DPO that you should have. And so I'm not too concerned about that aspect. I think there are ways to do it. And the questions that come sometimes on to protect data protection and privacy is because they just don't want to do it, which is understandable if their company want to avoid costs, but they will have to do it. They need to comply with the law, whether they like it or not. And then, well, Irene was mentioning some of the ideas how this can be done. I think generally a general description of the type of content and publish the reason why it was taken down, without publishing the username or the specific content that can be very personal material. And so that it can be done. I mean, we'll find a way that we need to discuss probably more and how this happens in practices. It's easier for some of us to say this should be how it's done than do it actually in practice. I agree with that. But I think it's an important matter for many people in the EU and probably around the world. So we need to find a way to make it happen.
Thank you.
Can I add just a few things in reaction, just very quick, because I think this needs to be clarified on my side. I'm not speaking about large companies like Google or Facebook, which definitely can take basically any amount of administrative burden you can throw at them. I'm speaking about smaller sized or medium-sized companies in Europe, where such an obligation to produce these reports and anonymize them and publish them would be very significant. And this is the difference. This is not about Google and Facebook. They can cope with that with no issues at all, I'm sure. I'm speaking about those smaller companies in Europe where there are hundreds, thousands of them that will have to cope with this. And this is going to be an issue. And I don't think they don't know how to do it. I think they know very well how to do it, but they can they understand what the amount of work is behind that. It's not just about let's do it. It's about that you will have to find employees that will do this, and this will be costly. And this is what I'm talking about, just to clarify.
Thank you. Irene, you have to leave us, if I'm correct. I would like to really thank you for squeezing us before your 10 a.m. meeting. And I wish you a lovely day going forward.
Thank you very much, and the same for you. Have a nice day. Bye.
According to my stopwatch, it's now time to move into the Q&A. We've opened the chat for questions. So I know it's always daunting to ask the first question, but please go ahead and ideally mention your affiliations and to whom you are asking the question so that we can make it more relevant. And as it often happens, we don't have a question yet, but I have one. For you, Diego, actually, we've discussing the intermediary transparency this morning. Authorities, maybe at the national European level, also take very important decisions. And in your view, how can we ensure their transparency vis-à-vis the public? Or is it a priority for you? And what would be the best way to ensure it?
From the authorities that regulate the DSA, you mean? Yes, again, I'm referring to Irene quite often, but she was speaking always before me, so that's why I have to do it. And she was mentioning how it is DSA is not only to bring transparency for companies, but also for DSCs, for the data DSA coordinators, right? And we see that because we have experience in data protection because of GDPR, and we also ask for transparency on how the DPAs operate, and I think they have a good history generally on doing so.
Diego, I think I have lost you, or is it just me?
No, I think we've lost Diego, unfortunately.
Well, this is the morning of internet issues. Maybe since we haven't received any question in the meantime, Mira, I'm going to have to grill you because you are my survivor panelist right now. You mentioned SMEs earlier on. Is there any, all the transparency topics that we've covered, you mentioned the high cost of statements of reasons for SMEs, but is there another one that you see that could have a big impact on European SMEs?
I think I would probably also mention, next to what we've already debated, the question of advertising transparency, which is also a great issue for those companies that are actually outsourcing the advertising from other companies and simply show the advertisement which is being sourced from other advertising networks, as they don't have any of its own. But still, they would be obliged to show those detailed information to users, which is very complicated without any cooperation with those providers of or operators of those advertising networks. So we feel that this is something that can be clearly labeled as unintended consequences, that this obligation is only thrown on the content providers and hosting services rather than in cooperation with providers of advertisement, where clearly there will need to be some cooperation to exchange all the necessary information between the advertising services and the hosting providers to show anything reasonable to users regarding the advertisements that are being shown on their websites. So clearly this is also something that is important for SMEs. And probably large question, I would say, is how to cope with the trusted pluggers, especially on smaller markets, like is the Czech Republic, for example, where the amount of reliable companies, especially because the content in Czech language is very limited. It's a small market. Which implies that there is also a small amount of say bodies that would be well balanced in regard of reporting and flagging content on those sites. This might not be an issue in Germany, in France, and other larger markets, definitely, but on smaller markets, the prioritizing of inputs coming from trusted flaggers, where it might not be that relevant, and the level of quality of reporting from those trusted flaggers on smaller markets might be an issue. This is also something concerning the SMEs, especially on markets like the Czech Republic and others of similar size. We've touched upon the questions of algorithmic transparency, which is a great issue for SMEs. I would probably repeat what we've already debated throughout the panel today.
Thank you for stepping. I see that Diego seems to be back online.
Yes.
Yeah, so sorry you got cut off in the middle of your intervention.
My connection dropped. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
So Michal heroically stepped in, but I'll let you resume on what you were saying.
Well, no, I think in case my connection drops again. No, we're just saying, well, the obvious that yes, companies need transparency, but yes, DSCs also they need as independent coordination, but they also need to be transparent. And I was saying that we come from the experience of GDPR, and we see how in the majority of DPA, data protection authorities, they do bring a lot of transparency. We know how they work, and we should know how they work. We don't. And the same should be for DSCs. If they have lots of power oversight, if they can have a lot of power on how content is put back on some platforms, or how search engines create content and so on. And they should also have a lot of strong accountability. And since Michal was mentioning the issue of trusted flagger, which is an important point, well, generally we believe that the trusted flaggers should be certified by DSCs, and then there should be a regular monitoring of the status of trusted flaggers if they don't comply with the professional standards, because we can imagine, especially from the copyright world, how a lot of copyright trolls, rights trolls especially, will do a lot of false flagging just to bring content down very quickly, and some people even make a living out of that. But we do not see that a commission has limited who can be a trusted flagger. So I think in the same way that we believe that vetted researchers should be, go through a process and be vetted, we would like to limit that. Especially, we want them to be not only independent from companies, but also independent from governments and commercial interests. I believe there are interesting amendments in that regard in the Sheldon report, in the INCO committee amendments that are being discussed. So something around that would be something that we would generally be supporting.
Thank you. I see there are no questions in the chat yet, so I know it's very early morning, but if you have any question, you have the opportunity to ask it either to a service provider or to a civil rights organization, which is always a very interesting panel to deal with. And so please go ahead, type in your question, and either Michal or Diego or both will try to answer it.
While people get active to ask questions, I will stop if someone asks a question, but I feel really bad with these awkward silences. So I want to go back to something that Michal said earlier, and not necessarily to contradict him, but to give another perspective. He was mentioning the issues of ad tech and opt-out of a recommender system, and in his case, he was mentioning how opt-out in search engines will not work. And again, indeed, when he was saying it makes sense, I am not sure how that actually would work in practice and who would want to opt out of that. But generally, if it is true, then it's probably true that most people would not like to opt out of anything. I think that's a good option, and just leave people the opportunity to opt out if they want. If the majority don't want to opt out, especially for search engines, again, I really don't know how that would work in practice. We always have other type of companies in mind. Well, if they don't want to, then they will keep having it, and I think that's not a big problem. And on ad tech, he was saying that it was a political subject. It was a bit I'm thinking it was a touchy subject, and I agree with that. But to some extent, it should not be, because we have the privacy directive that deals with a lot of online tracking, and we have in the pipeline the privacy regulation that should block a lot of this probably illegal already hoovering of personal data to give personalized advertising. So to some extent, when the GDPR said we need to phase out behavioral advertising, we believe that's the way in which we should be going. But generally speaking, there's a step back before that. It's not, perhaps we don't need to phase out anything. Perhaps we need to implement the legislation. But since that is not happening in practice, probably the DSA could give another nail in the coffin, and then really reform this industry and go back to either contextual advertising or other types of. Sometimes people will have to pay for some of the content. So I don't think that's better than generally paying with your personal data and your activities online without being aware of that. But we really need to see how that works in practice.
Thank you. As I see, we don't have any question yet. I don't know. If you guess, Mira, you want to answer something.
Yeah. While waiting for the questions, let's turn up the debate. We just started with with Diego on the recommender system and the question of opt-out. I agree with. I would agree if that would be only the question of creating some opt-out button on the side of companies, for example, with a search engine. If that would be just create that button, I would agree that there's no reason why not to have it, and why not have that option for users to opt out, even though there will be an absolute minority of users that would actually decide to opt out. The problem is, it's not just about creating that opt-out button. It's about creating a complicated, sophisticated technology backend that would actually even allow to offer the service for users in both regimes of working. And I think it's very unfair to ask companies to create something super costly in this regard, and even know that there will be only a super minority of users actually using it. Maybe no one, because the users will realize that this is something they don't want to use, in fact. So this is the reason why I think we should be very careful about striking these obligations and these ideas. And this is the reason why I believe that this is one of those good examples why search engines don't fit very well into the DSA as just another regular hosting or online platform type of service.
Well, the things that I also, looking backwards in history, I remember how in the beginning car manufacturers were opposing to seatbelts being imposed on cars, because they need to, it's not like putting a button, they need to create a whole infrastructure, they need to create a system, they need to test it, they put it in the cars, and someone needs to do all of that, and that's a lot of practice. But we thought there was a societal benefit in doing so, and we obliged companies to do that. And I am sure most people don't like using seatbelts in cars or in planes, but we have to. I think there's a societal benefit that in a way overweight the private interest in this case. And yes, I can imagine that if I were on your side, it would be paying the neck to now create such a system, and it's not just creating a button that I can imagine, but I think we need to find a way to make it happen. And I'd like to insist that the fact of the European small and medium companies that may face difficulties in doing so, we need to help them to make it happen. What we want to avoid was what happened to some extent with the copyright directive, and also with some of the GDPR implementation, is to by imposing obligations, giving even more power to the big companies. So in a way, I agree with you in that, okay, I think that the regulation needs to happen in one way or another, but we need to find a way to not harm alternative to Google's search, such as SNAP. So I think we need to find a way to make it happen.
I agree. I agree that it's clearly about the benefits that we need to see in that very specific case. And as you say, seatbelts clearly have some benefits that we can look over, and some figures we can look over on the amount of lives that are being saved every single day by using the seatbelts. if there would be the debate in this level, looking at numbers that would actually show the benefits of what is the real benefit of having that opt-out, for example, on a search engine for those minority of users that would probably use it, that would be the moment where I would say yes, this is clearly something that we should have. But I'm afraid this I don't have any such clear benefits that would overweigh the costs for all the businesses all around Europe that would have to cope with them.
Thank you both. I see we have received a first question on trusted flaggers, and I think it is directed to you, Michal. In case in which there is an unresolved intellectual property conflict between the trusted flagger and the seller that is still pending to be decided by justice, what is the platform supposed to do according to the DSA?
My understanding is that it will be the free will of the platform to decide whether it's more risky to keep the content up or if it's more risky to take the content down, based on all the information that the platform will be able to gather on this case in that specific scenario. So it will be the risk of the platform that will simply have to make some decision and be able to keep up with this decision once the judicial system will finish looking over this case and will put up some final decision. And I hope that in that specific case, those safeguards in terms of Good Samaritan would work out for the hosting platform, that would protect against any eventually damage claims that might arise in that specific scenario.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I generally agree with Michal. I would have a question actually for the person who asked the question, because I'm not sure if he meant copyright or he meant patents or any other type of intellectual property. I can imagine he meant copyright. If that is the case, please, we already have copyright directive we fought against for many years. Whether we like it or not, it's in place, and we need to use the vertical legislation and not again reopen the copyright debate in the DSA. Whether we like it or not, and we're not big fans of the copyright directive, as many of you know, it is there. It's being implemented in member states, not in many, which is a good sign. And but in any case, it exists, and we should use that and the DSA. And for other type of intellectual property, I know for example, the BEUC, the consumer organization, is interested in fake products and all of that. So I think for that, what Michal mentioned, if there's a disagreement, you bring it to the courts. That would be a normal course of action in a democratic society.
Thank you. I am going to give an extra minute to participants to ask a few questions, and if not, I'll be forced to move ahead. I'm really sorry. There is always the job of the moderator, to keep a watchful eye over the clock. In the meantime, and since we started, discussing the liability of intermediaries in that sense, just for your general information, the end of September, we'll actually host a webinar on this topic. So feel free to join if this is a topic of particular interest for you. All right. So I don't see any more questions. But I would like to give you guys the floor one last time for short concluding remarks. So not on the last topic we discussed, but transparency as a whole. If you have any last words of advice, any suggestion, now is the time. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I'll go alphabetically. Diego, do you want to start?
Well, no big question marks, remarks in the end. Just saying what we said before. There's a lot of big text in the DSA about transparency. It can be fine-tuned. There are good ideas in the Internal Markets Committee report, and there are also bad ideas. So don't get the bad ideas. But I think with that, and we're having some bearing in mind the alternatives to Google, such as Sesam or Quant or any other companies that exist in EU, that we should definitely not harm them, but rather helping them to go through this process. There's a lot of work to be done still, months, perhaps years, to make it happen and to make it work, but in general for the benefit of the society in general, but also to create an alternative system to the current big tech dominated system we suffer today.
Thank you, Michal. On your way to becoming a big tech, what do you have to say to that? And do you have any concluding remark on the whole topic of the seminar?
I'll probably add to what has already been said, that it's about tweaks here and there in regard of the legislation process, many of them already addressed in the amendments that we can see coming out from the Parliament. At the same time, I'm very proud that CESNAM is already a company that, even without having DSA enforced, is already taking the transparency issue very seriously. The terms and conditions on all of our services are very well thought and very well transparent, as much as we can, to show the users that we really play in their interest, and it's an open game. We understand very well that it's the users who actually decide whether they want or they don't want to use our services, and it's very easy to betray them and they will never come back. And for that reason, it's always the interest of the company to be transparent enough to keep their users and not lose them for the competition. So I think the DSA is bringing a level playing field in many areas. Still, many of those are already evolved by companies voluntarily, and I think if we tweak those details, like the question of search engines and many others in the final text, I think we will have a quite good piece of legislation.
Well, thank you, and I share your hopes about what's going to become in the DSA. But yeah, so now comes the time to close this session. First of all, I'd like to thank you, to thank our panelists, and also to thank the Euro-ISPA Secretariat for the whole work of organization that goes behind the scene. Once again, so many thanks to Links for sponsoring this event, and also, of course, to the public for showing up in great numbers this early in the morning. If you want to have a recap of this event or witness the best moment of this morning's session, just know that we'll publish a recap and the recording of today's stream. And I hope that I'll see many of you in the end of September to discuss the liability of intermediaries for our 4th DSA session. And you'll receive an invite in your inbox very soon, so stay tuned to that. And until then, thank you so much, and I wish you a wonderful day. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.